The mud-caked woman stood at the edge of what had once been her family farm, watching the swollen river still churning brown and violent 3 days after it had swallowed everything she had ever known. Clara Whitfield was 22 years old and felt ancient. The floodwaters had risen in the middle of the night without warning, a wall of destruction that came roaring down from the broken levee 15 miles upstream. She had barely escaped with her nightdress and her life, scrambling onto the roof as the house groaned and twisted beneath her. She had clung there for 6 hours in the darkness, listening to the cattle drown, listening to the timbers of her childhood home splinter and crack. When dawn finally broke over Wichita, Kansas, that terrible morning in June of 1889, Clara discovered she was alone on a small island of debris. Everything familiar transformed into a savage brown sea that stretched in every direction. The rescue boat had found her delirious and nearly frozen despite the summer heat. They pulled her aboard wrapped in a blanket that smelled of tobacco and sweat, and she had not spoken a word in the 3 days since. Not when they told her the flood had taken 14 lives in the county. Not when they said her parents' bodies had been found 2 miles downstream, tangled in a fence line with 3 other souls who would never see another sunrise. Not when the Reverend tried to pray over her in the makeshift shelter at the Baptist church, where 24 families now lived among donated blankets and the constant sound of crying children. Clara simply stared. The world had become a strange and distant thing, like she was watching it through thick glass. Food tasted like nothing. The sun meant nothing. She moved when people told her to move, sat when they indicated she should sit. But inside she felt hollow as a gourd scraped clean of everything that had once made her human. She had returned to the farm site that morning because she could not think of anywhere else to go. The church shelter suffocated her with its crowded misery, everyone's grief pressing against her own until she thought she might scream just to hear a sound that was entirely hers. So she had walked the 4 miles in borrowed boots 2 sizes too large, trudging through mud that sucked at her feet with every step, until she stood looking at the empty space where her life used to be. The house was simply gone. The barn was gone. The chicken coop, the smokehouse, the garden her mother had tended for 20 years, all of it erased as thoroughly as pencil marks under an eraser. Only the stone foundation remained, a rectangular outline filled with silt and broken boards, and one half of her father's plow jutting up like a gravestone. "You planning to stay here all day?" The voice came from behind her, and Clara turned slowly. A man sat astride a bay horse, watching her with an expression that held neither pity nor judgment, just a frank appraisal that made her suddenly aware of how she must look. Her borrowed dress hung on her frame, too short in the hem and too wide in the shoulders. Her dark hair hung in a braid she had not bothered to redo in days, coming loose in strands around her face. She probably looked half mad, standing here staring at nothing. "I said, you planning to stay here all day?" he repeated, swinging down from the saddle with easy grace. He was tall and lean, somewhere in his mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that needed cutting. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, worn denim, and a shirt that had been mended at the elbow. His eyes were an unexpected green, startling in his tanned face. "Because the sun will set in about 6 hours, and I do not figure you want to be out here in the dark." Clara found her voice, rusty from disuse. "I have nowhere else to go. You one of the flood folks staying at the church," she nodded. "Then you have somewhere to go. Maybe not somewhere good, but somewhere." He pulled his horse forward, studying the ruined foundation. "This was your place, my parents' place. They are dead." The man removed his hat, a gesture of respect. "I am sorry, truly. The flood was a terrible thing." He paused, then added, "My name is Lucas Quinn. I work the Triple Bar Ranch about 10 miles west. We are on higher ground, so we missed the worst of it. Clara Whitfield." The words felt strange in her mouth, like she was introducing someone she used to know. Lucas Quinn walked around the foundation, his boots squelching in the mud. "How much land did your family have?" 80 acres. We farmed 40, ran some cattle on the rest." She did not know why she was answering his questions, but the sound of conversation felt almost normal, and normal was something she desperately needed. "Any of it mortgaged?" "No. My father paid it off 5 years ago. He was very proud of that." Lucas nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon. Then he turned back to her with that direct green gaze. "I am going to say something, and I want you to hear me all the way through before you answer." "Can you do that?" Clara shrugged. What did it matter what this stranger said? What did anything matter? This land is on a flood plain. That river jumps its banks every 20 years or so, sometimes worse. Your parents were probably here during the last bad flood in 1869, and they rebuilt, and that is admirable. But if you rebuild here again, it will happen again eventually. He paused, measuring her reaction, then continued. But about a half-mile west of here, the elevation rises maybe 30 feet. Still part of your property, I am guessing. High enough that the flood did not touch it. Good soil, good drainage. Better for a homestead than this low ground ever was. She stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I have been watching this valley for 3 days, seeing all these folks picking through the ruins, planning to rebuild in the exact same spots that just got destroyed. And I keep thinking what a waste it is, all this suffering, if nobody learns anything from it." He put his hat back on, adjusting the brim against the afternoon sun. "You have a chance to start fresh. Build smart instead of just building. I do not have money to build anything. I do not even have a nail or a board or a single tool." "No, but you have land. Clear title to 80 acres if what you say about the mortgage is true. That counts for something. That counts for a lot, actually." Lucas walked back to his horse, checking the saddle straps. "I am going to make you an offer, Miss Whitfield, and like I said before, I want you to hear me all the way through." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the June heat. "I am listening. I have been working cattle for other men since I was 14 years old. I am 26 now, and I have saved nearly every dollar I have earned. I have been looking for land to buy, but everything decent around Wichita is either taken or priced too high for a working cowboy. I want my own place, want to run my own herd, build something that belongs to me." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You need a house, I need land. I am proposing a trade." "What kind of trade?" "I will build you a house. A good one, proper frame construction, 2 rooms to start with room to add more later. I will build it on that high ground I mentioned, where the floods cannot reach it. In exchange, you let me run my cattle on your land. We split the property, say 40 acres for you to farm if you want, 40 acres for me to graze. We draw up papers making it all legal, clear boundaries, clear terms." Clara felt dizzy. "You want to buy my land?" "No, you keep ownership. This would be more like a lease, except I am paying in labor instead of cash. You need help getting back on your feet, and I need a start. We help each other." It was too much to process, too many words and ideas crashing into the numbness that had protected her for 3 days. "I do not understand. You do not even know me. Why would you do this?" Lucas Quinn looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened. "Because I know what it is like to lose everything. My parents died of cholera when I was 12, left me and my sister alone. Good people took us in, gave us a chance when they did not have to. I figure maybe it is time I paid that forward." He gathered his reins, preparing to mount. "You do not have to answer now. Think about it. I will be back tomorrow at noon to see if you are interested. If you are, we will ride out and look at that high ground together. If you are not, I will leave you be, and that will be the end of it." He swung into the saddle with fluid ease, but Clara found herself speaking before he could ride away. "Wait, why me? Why not make this offer to one of the other families who lost their homes?" His green eyes held hers steadily. "Because you are here alone. Because you have clear title with no mortgage. And because when I saw you standing here looking at nothing, you reminded me of how my sister looked after our folks died. Like you were not sure if there was any point in keeping on breathing." His voice gentled. "But there is a point, Miss Whitfield. There is always a point. Sometimes you just need help remembering what it is." He touched his hat brim in farewell and turned his horse west, leaving Clara standing in the mud with her thoughts spinning for the first time in days. She watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the endless Kansas sky, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was too large a thing to feel yet, but maybe the smallest possibility that hope might someday be possible again. She walked back to the church as the sun lowered toward the horizon, and that night she lay on her donated blanket and did not stare at the ceiling. Instead, she thought about high ground and new houses, and a stranger with kind green eyes who had seen her at her lowest and offered a hand up instead of pity. When Lucas Quinn returned at noon the next day, Clara was waiting at the farm site wearing a borrowed bonnet and carrying a canteen someone had given her. He smiled when he saw her, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and said, "Ready to see your new home site?" "I have not agreed to anything yet," she said, but there was no heat in the words. "No, but you came. That is a start." He helped her up onto his horse, and Clara was intensely aware of his hands on her waist, strong and careful. She settled behind the saddle, not sure where to put her hands, until Lucas said, "You will need to hold on. The ground gets rough." She gripped his shoulders, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt, and they rode west across her family's land. She had walked this property 1,000 times but saw it differently now, through eyes sharpened by loss. The flood had left its mark everywhere, debris scattered across the fields, dead plants and animals rotting in the sun. But as they climbed the gentle rise Lucas had mentioned, the devastation fell away. Here the grass still grew green. Here the wildflowers still bloomed yellow and purple in the tall prairie grass. Here the land rolled away in every direction under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Lucas reined in at the top of the rise and helped Clara down. "See how the land slopes away on all sides. Water will never pool here, will always drain off, and look back toward the river." Clara turned and caught her breath. From this vantage point she could see for miles. The river wound through the valley like a brown ribbon, and beyond it, the town of Wichita spread out in the distance, church steeples and buildings visible in the clear air. She could see her old farm site too, the foundation a small rectangle far below, and she understood with sudden clarity how vulnerable that location had been, how foolish to build in such low ground. "My father chose that spot because it was close to water for the animals," she said quietly. "He never thought about what would happen if there was too much water. Most folks do not. They think about convenience, not danger." Lucas walked a slow circle, his experienced eye reading the land. "Here, you would need to dig a well, but the water table is good in this area. You would need to haul supplies up the slope, but it is not so steep that a wagon could not manage. And once you were built and established, this would be one of the finest homesteads in the county." Clara closed her eyes and tried to imagine it, a house standing where she stood now, solid and safe. Fields planted in the rich soil, maybe a garden like her mother had kept, maybe chickens scratching in a yard and a milk cow grazing nearby. The images came slowly, painfully, but they came. "What would this house look like?" she asked. Lucas pulled a folded paper from his pocket, and Clara was surprised to see he had sketched a rough plan. 2 rooms to start, like I said. 1 main room for living and cooking, 1 bedroom for privacy, front porch facing east to catch the morning sun. Good foundation, proper floor joists so you are not walking on dirt, cedar shake roof that will last 20 years if it is maintained properly. He handed her the sketch. Later, if you wanted, it would be easy to add on. Another bedroom, maybe a proper kitchen, room to grow. Clara studied the drawing, noting the careful measurements, the precise lines. "You have done this before. Built houses. Some. Mostly barns and outbuildings, but the principles are the same. I am handy with tools, always have been, and what I do not know I can learn from the carpenters in town." He tucked the paper back in his pocket. "I figure it would take me about 6 weeks to get it built and livable, working every evening after my duties at the Triple Bar and all day on Sundays. Maybe longer if the weather does not cooperate. You would need to stay at the church shelter until it was done, but then you would have a real home again. 6 weeks. It seemed like an eternity and no time at all." Clara turned away, looking out over the valley, trying to organize her tangled thoughts. "You said we would draw up papers. What exactly would they say?" "Whatever you want them to say. I am not trying to cheat you, Miss Whitfield. We would go to a lawyer in town, have everything written down proper and legal. Basic terms would be that I build you a house on the location of your choosing, and in exchange you grant me grazing rights for my cattle on 40 acres for a period of, say, 10 years. We would establish clear boundaries. You keep full ownership of the land and can sell it whenever you want, but the grazing rights transfer to any new owner until the 10 years are up. After that, we renegotiate if you want, or we part ways, and that is that. And if I want to farm some of the land, then we make sure the boundaries account for that. Like I said, 40 acres is more than enough for my purposes. I only have about 30 head right now anyway, though I plan to grow the herd. 40 acres for you to do whatever you want with is fair." Clara chewed her lip, thinking. It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous. Why not just use your savings to buy your own land? Because land with grazing rights goes for about $3 an acre around here, and I do not have $240 saved up. I have about half that. I could buy less land, but 40 acres is not enough to run a proper cattle operation. This way we both get what we need." He paused. "And honestly, Miss Whitfield, I think you need help, and I have help to offer. Seems foolish to let pride stand in the way when we could both benefit." Pride. Yes, that was what made her hesitate. The idea of accepting charity, of being beholden to anyone. But this was not charity, was it? This was a business arrangement, straight and fair. He got land. She got a house. Nobody owed anybody except what was spelled out in a legal contract. "I want to add something to the terms," Clara said slowly. "If you are going to run your cattle on my land, I want a percentage of any profit you make when you sell them. Not half, I am not asking for that, but maybe 10% as rent." Lucas considered this, then nodded. "That is fair. 10% of profit after expenses are deducted. We keep records of everything, all transparent." He extended his hand. "Do we have an agreement in principle, Miss Whitfield?" Clara looked at his outstretched hand, calloused from years of hard work, steady and sure. She thought about the church shelter and the pity in people's eyes and the hollow feeling that had consumed her since the flood. She thought about her parents, who had worked this land for decades and would want her to survive, to continue. She thought about this stranger who had no reason to help her except simple human decency, and she made her choice. She gripped his hand firmly. "We have an agreement, Mr. Quinn, in principle and in fact." His smile was like sunrise. Then let us go to town and make it legal." They rode double back across the property, and Clara found she was not bothered by the necessity of holding on to Lucas for balance. There was something solid about him, something trustworthy that her instincts recognized even though her head told her she barely knew him. At the church, she borrowed clean clothes from the charity donations, and they walked together to the office of Marcus Thornton, the only lawyer in Wichita who had not lost his building to the flood. Thornton was a shrewd older man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and he listened carefully as Lucas explained their arrangement. "This is unusual," he said when Lucas finished, "but not unheard of. Lease agreements in exchange for improvements are perfectly legal. I will need to see the deed to verify Miss Whitfield's ownership." "It burned with the house," Clara said, then stopped, realizing that was not quite true. "Wait. My father kept important papers in a lockbox at the bank. Would the deed be there? Most likely. Let us go check." The First National Bank of Wichita had survived the flood, being on higher ground near the center of town, and the manager remembered Clara's father. He retrieved the lockbox from the vault, and inside they found the deed along with her parents' marriage certificate, her own birth certificate, and a handful of other documents that constituted the paper trail of a life. Seeing her father's signature on the deed made Clara's throat tight, but she swallowed hard and carried the document back to Thornton's office. The lawyer spent an hour drafting a contract, asking questions and making revisions until both Clara and Lucas were satisfied. The terms were clear. Lucas Quinn would construct a house of agreed-upon specifications on Clara Whitfield's property, said house to include at minimum 2 rooms and a porch, with sound foundation and weather-tight roof. In exchange, Clara Whitfield granted Lucas Quinn grazing rights for up to 50 head of cattle on the western 40 acres of her property for a period of 10 years, with Clara to receive 10% of net profits from the sale of any cattle grazed on said property. Boundaries were marked on a surveyor's map. Clara retained full ownership and right to sell, with grazing rights transferring to any purchaser. Either party could void the agreement if the other failed to meet the terms, as determined by binding arbitration. "This protects both of you," Thornton said, sliding the document across his desk. "Miss Whitfield, if Mr. Quinn fails to build the house to specification, or within a reasonable time frame, you can void the agreement. Mr. Quinn, if Miss Whitfield sells the property before your 10 years are up, your grazing rights continue regardless of the new owner. Everything is clear and enforceable." Clara read through the contract twice, her lips moving silently over the legal language. It was strange seeing her life reduced to these formal sentences, but everything seemed fair. She signed her name carefully, aware that this was the first significant decision she had made as an adult without her parents' guidance. Lucas signed as well, his script surprisingly neat for a working cowboy. They each kept a copy, and Thornton filed the original with the county clerk. When they walked out of the lawyer's office, Clara felt lighter than she had in days, as if signing that contract had given her permission to start imagining a future again. "I start tomorrow," Lucas said as they stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the office. "I already talked to my boss at Triple Bar, and he is willing to let me adjust my hours so I can work on the house. I will need to buy lumber and supplies, so it might be a few days before you see real progress. But I promise you, Miss Whitfield, you will have a roof over your head before summer ends." "Thank you," Clara said, and the words felt inadequate for what she was feeling. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else just saw another flood victim to pity." "I see a survivor," Lucas said simply. "And survivors do not give up. They build new lives on higher ground." Over the next week, Clara watched as Lucas began the work. He enlisted help from 2 other cowboys at his ranch, men named Jake and Samuel, who treated her with respectful courtesy and worked like demons once the lumber arrived. They dug the foundation holes and set corner posts, creating the skeleton of what would become her house. Lucas worked through the heat of the day, his shirt soaked with sweat, his hands steady on hammer and saw. Clara could not simply watch. She began helping however she could, hauling water from the temporary well they dug, preparing simple meals over a fire, holding boards steady while Lucas measured and cut. The other flood survivors thought she was crazy, living in a tent on her property instead of staying at the church. But Clara needed to be here, needed to see the house rising board by board, proof that she could build something from nothing. As they worked side by side, Clara learned things about Lucas Quinn. He had been born in Missouri but moved to Kansas with his parents when he was 8. His sister Sarah had married a shopkeeper in Topeka and had 2 children Lucas had never met. He loved horses, tolerated cattle, and dreamed of breeding quality stock horses someday. He could not carry a tune but whistled constantly while he worked. He took his coffee black and his conscience clear, and he never once made Clara feel like she owed him anything beyond what they had agreed upon in writing. And Clara found herself talking too, sharing memories of her parents, of growing up on the farm, of the small dreams she had nurtured before the flood washed everything away. She had wanted to be a teacher once, had loved reading the few books her mother owned. She missed her mother's singing voice, missed her father's laugh. She was terrified of water now, could not even look at the river without her hands shaking. "That will fade," Lucas told her one evening as they sat watching the sunset from the foundation of the half-built house. "Not disappear, maybe, but fade. Fear has less power when you face it head-on. Is that what you did? With your parents, in a way. I was angry for a long time after they died. Angry at God, angry at the world, angry at them for leaving. Then one day I realized being angry was just another way of staying stuck. So I decided to be grateful instead. Grateful I had them for 12 years, grateful for the people who helped Sarah and me, grateful to be alive when so many folks are not." He picked up a wood shaving, turning it over in his fingers. "Grief does not disappear, but you learn to carry it different." Clara thought about that as she lay in her tent that night, listening to the prairie sounds that had frightened her at first but were becoming familiar. Maybe Lucas was right. Maybe grief was something you learned to carry rather than something that carried you. The house took shape week by week. Walls rose, solid and straight. Window frames went in, and Clara spent a precious $1 on real glass panes because she could not stand the thought of living behind shutters like a cave dweller. The roof went on during a week of blistering heat. Lucas and his helpers hauling cedar shakes up a ladder while Clara watched from below, her heart in her throat every time someone's foot slipped. In early August, 6.5 weeks after they had shaken hands on that high ground, Lucas nailed the last board onto the front porch and stepped back. "It is done," he said, and his voice held a note of pride that made Clara's chest ache. "Welcome home, Miss Whitfield." She walked through her new house slowly, taking in every detail. The main room was spacious, with a stone fireplace Lucas had built himself in the corner. The bedroom was small but cozy, with a window that looked east toward the sunrise. The porch was wide enough for chairs, for sitting in the evening and watching the world. The floors were level, the walls were plumb, and the whole structure felt solid as bedrock. "It is perfect," Clara said, and her voice broke. "It is absolutely perfect." Lucas had been watching her anxiously, but at her words he relaxed. "I am glad you like it. It is not fancy, but it is sound. It will stand through any storm this prairie can throw at it." Clara turned to him, and suddenly she was crying, tears streaming down her face for the first time since the flood. "You built me a home. You gave me back my life." He crossed the room in 2 strides and caught her hands in his green eyes intense. "No, Clara, you did that yourself. I just provided some lumber and labor. You are the one who decided to keep going. You are the one who fought your way back from that darkness. Do not give me credit that belongs to you." It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it from his lips made something flutter in her chest. She realized she was still holding his hands, that they were standing very close in her new empty house, and the moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Lucas seemed to realize it too. He cleared his throat and stepped back, releasing her hands. "I should go. I need to bring my cattle over tomorrow, get them settled on their section. You will need furniture and supplies. Do you need help getting set up?" "I have a little money saved," Clara said, swiping at her tears. "The banker found an account my parents kept, not much but enough to buy a bed and a table and some basics." "Good. That is good." Lucas moved toward the door, and Clara sensed his awkwardness, the careful distance he was maintaining. They had grown easy with each other over the weeks of building, but now that the work was done, something had shifted. The boundaries were less clear. "Lucas," she said as he reached the door. "Will I still see you? Now that the house is finished?" He turned, and his smile was warm. "Clara, I have 30 head of cattle eating grass on your land. You will see me plenty. I will be checking on the herd every few days, mending fence, keeping things in order. We are neighbors now and partners. You are not getting rid of me that easy." Relief flooded through her. "Good, because I would miss our conversations." "Me too," he said softly. Then he put his hat on and walked out into the evening, leaving Clara alone in her new house, feeling less alone than she had in months. True to his word, Lucas became a regular presence on her property. He brought his cattle over and set them to grazing on the western acres. He rode the fence lines and repaired the breaks. He showed Clara how to manage the boundary markers so she would know if the cattle strayed onto her farming acreage. He was professional, courteous, and friendly, and Clara found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that had nothing to do with their business arrangement. She began furnishing her house, piece by piece. A bed frame and mattress purchased from a widow selling her late husband's belongings. A table and 2 chairs bought from the general store. Dishes and a cast iron skillet, towels and blankets. A rocking chair someone was throwing out that just needed a new cane seat. She learned to cook for one, to keep house alone, to fall asleep without the sounds of other people breathing nearby. But it was lonely. Clara had never lived alone before, had gone from her parents' house to the church shelter to this solitary existence. And some evenings, the silence pressed on her like a physical weight. She took to sitting on her porch in the hour before sunset, watching the sky paint itself in shades of orange and pink. And more often than not, Lucas would ride up during that hour, as if he somehow knew when she needed company. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about his day, about the foal that had been born at Triple Bar, about the traveling preacher who had come through town promising salvation and selling patent medicine. She told him about the garden she was planning, about the chickens she wanted to buy come spring, about the letter she had finally written to her aunt in Ohio, letting family know about her parents' deaths. One evening in late September, as the air turned cool with the first hint of autumn, Lucas rode up to find Clara struggling with a broken porch board. "Here, let me," he said, swinging down from his horse and pulling a hammer from his saddlebag. "You do not have to fix everything for me," Clara protested, but she stepped back to let him work. "I know, but I want to. Besides, I built this house. I have a personal stake in it staying in good repair." He pried up the broken board and examined the joist underneath. "This needs a new support." "I will bring one next time I come." "You are always bringing things, doing things. Lucas, you have already done so much." He sat back on his heels, looking up at her. "Maybe I like having a reason to come by." The air seemed to thicken between them. Clara's heart began to beat faster. "You do not need a reason. You are always welcome here." "Am I?" He stood slowly, the broken board forgotten. "Because sometimes I worry I am overstaying my welcome, that you let me visit because you feel obligated by our agreement." "That is not why," Clara said, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. "That is not why at all." Lucas took a step closer. Then why, she could have dissembled, could have given a light answer and changed the subject. But Clara had survived a flood and the death of her parents and the slow clawing journey back to life, and she was done being anything less than honest. "Because when you are here, I feel less alone, because you make me laugh. Because I think you are the kindest, most decent man I have ever known, and when you ride away, I count the hours until you come back." His eyes widened, and for a moment he just stared at her. Then he closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his calloused hands. "Clara, I have been half in love with you since the day I found you standing in the mud looking at nothing. I tried to keep my distance, tried to be professional and respectful, but Lord help me, I think about you every waking minute." "Then stop keeping your distance," Clara breathed, and Lucas kissed her. It was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if he was afraid she might break. But when Clara wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the loneliness and longing she had been carrying, he pulled her closer, deepening the kiss until her knees went weak. She had been kissed before, clumsy attempts by farm boys at church socials, but this was different. This was Lucas, and it felt like coming home when they finally broke apart. Both breathing hard, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "I should not have done that. We have a business arrangement, and I do not want you to think I expect anything beyond what we agreed. Lucas Quinn, if you apologize for kissing me, I will never forgive you," Clara said fiercely. "I wanted that. I have wanted that for weeks." He laughed, the sound full of relief and joy. "Have you now?" "Yes. And if you do not do it again, I will be very disappointed." So he kissed her again, slower this time, sweeter, and when darkness fell they were still on her porch, wrapped in each other's arms, talking in low voices about how this had happened and what it meant and where they went from here. "I want to court you properly," Lucas said. "I want to do this right. You have been through so much, and I do not want to rush you into anything. You built me a house, Lucas. I think we are a bit past the normal stages of courtship. Even so, I want people to see that I respect you, that my intentions are honorable." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch infinitely gentle. "Clara Whitfield, may I have your permission to court you?" "Yes," she said, smiling up at him in the starlight. "Yes, you may." They kept their courtship quiet at first, but Wichita was a small town and word spread quickly. People talked, of course. Some said Lucas was taking advantage of Clara's vulnerability. Others said Clara was trying to trap a young cowboy into marriage. But most folks, seeing them together at church on Sundays or walking through town on a Saturday afternoon, recognized what was actually happening. Two lonely people had found each other in the aftermath of tragedy and were building something good from the ruins. Lucas brought her flowers from the prairie, great armfuls of goldenrod, and asked her that she arranged in jars on her table. Clara mended his shirts and made him apple pie from fruit she bought at the market. They rode out together to check his cattle, and he taught her to read the signs of good grazing land, healthy animals, weather changes coming. She showed him her garden plans, and he helped her mark out the beds for next spring's planting. In November, Lucas came to her house after dark, his face serious. "I need to tell you something, and I am not sure how you are going to take it." Clara's stomach dropped. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong, exactly. It is just that I have been offered a job, not at Triple Bar. A bigger outfit down in Oklahoma Territory, running their entire cattle operation. It is good money, really good money, and it is the kind of position that could set me up for life." He paused, looking miserable. "But it would mean leaving Kansas, leaving you." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "When would you have to go?" "They want an answer by the end of the month. I would start in January." He reached for her hands. "I told them I needed to think about it, because, Clara, I do not want to leave you. These past few months have been the happiest of my life. But I also know we have only been courting since September. I have no right to ask you to make any kind of decision about your future based on what we have together." Clara felt panic rising in her chest. She had finally rebuilt her life, had finally found happiness again, and now it was threatening to slip away. "What do you want to do?" "Honestly, I want to turn down the job and stay here with you. But I keep thinking that is foolish, giving up an opportunity like this for a relationship that is still so new." He looked at her with anguished eyes. "Tell me what to do, Clara." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was too important to rush, too important to let fear make the decision. "I cannot tell you what to do. This has to be your choice, but I can tell you what I want." She squeezed his hands, holding his gaze. "I love you, Lucas. I did not plan to fall in love again so soon after losing everything, but I did. I love you and I want a future with you, wherever that future is. If you take that job in Oklahoma, I will go with you. If you stay in Kansas, I will build that future here. But please, do not make this decision based on what you think you should do. Make it based on what you want." Lucas stared at her for a long moment, and she saw emotions chasing across his face, too fast to name. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I love you too. God, Clara, I love you so much. And what I want is to stay here, build a life on this land with you, raise our cattle and our children and grow old watching the sunset from your porch." He pulled back just enough to see her face. "Marry me. Not in a year, not when it is more respectable. Marry me now this winter, so we can start our life together as soon as possible." Joy flooded through her, so intense it was almost painful. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." They were married on Christmas Day, 1889, in the Baptist church that had sheltered Clara after the flood. It was a simple ceremony attended by half the town, because everyone loved a wedding, especially a wedding that represented hope and new beginnings. Clara wore a dress borrowed from Lucas's boss's wife, cream-colored wool with lace at the collar and cuffs. Lucas wore a new suit he had bought specially for the occasion, and he could not stop smiling, his joy infectious. The reverend who performed the ceremony spoke about trials and perseverance, about building on solid foundations and trusting in God's plan. Clara barely heard the words. She was too focused on Lucas, on the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world, on the feeling of his hand holding hers as they spoke their vows. "I, Lucas Quinn, take you, Clara Whitfield, to be my wife. I promise to stand by you in flood and drought, in sickness and health, for all the days of my life. I, Clara Whitfield, take you, Lucas Quinn, to be my husband. I promise to build my life with yours, to weather every storm together for all the days of my life." When the reverend pronounced them man and wife, Lucas kissed her to cheers and applause, and Clara felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They celebrated with a small reception at the church, cake and coffee, and the whole town wishing them well. Then they rode together back to the house on the hill, the house Lucas had built, the house that was now truly their home. That night, wrapped in her husband's arms in the bed they would share for the rest of their lives. Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. The flood that had taken everything, the darkness that had nearly consumed her, the stranger on a horse who had seen past her grief and offered not pity but partnership, the slow rebuilding, board by board, day by day, until she was whole again. "What are you thinking?" Lucas murmured against her hair. "I am thinking that the flood tried to destroy me, but instead it brought me to you. I am thinking that sometimes the worst things lead to the best things if we are brave enough to keep moving forward." He tightened his arms around her. "You are the bravest person I know, Clara Quinn. Clara Quinn." She tested the name silently, liking the sound of it. Clara Whitfield had been the girl whose life was washed away. Clara Quinn was the woman who had built a new one, stronger and better than before. Winter passed into spring, and Clara planted her garden in the soil that had never known flood. She ordered chickens from a farmer in town, 6 red hens and a rooster who crowed every morning at dawn. Lucas expanded his herd to 40 head, and Clara kept meticulous records of expenses and profits, calculating her 10% share with satisfaction. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and comfort was a blessing Clara never took for granted. In late April, Clara woke feeling queasy and realized with a jolt what it meant. She waited another week to be sure, then told Lucas over dinner one evening, watching his face transform from confusion to understanding to pure elation in the space of a heartbeat. "A baby. We are having a baby." "Yes, come November, I think." He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the kitchen until she was dizzy and laughing. "We need to add on to the house. We need another bedroom, and we should get a better stove. This one is too small. And we need to save money for a doctor. Make sure you have proper care when the time comes." Clara cupped his face in her hands, still smiling. "Lucas, we have months. We have time to prepare. I just want everything perfect for you, for our baby. It already is perfect. We have a home, we have each other, we have a future. That is more than enough." But Lucas was determined, and by the time autumn arrived, he had added a second bedroom to the house and bought a beautiful cast iron stove that heated evenly and had 4 cooking plates instead of 2. He traded work for a cradle that one of the ranch hands carved from cherry wood, and he whitewashed the new bedroom until it gleamed. Their son was born on November 15th, 1890, during a cold snap that frosted the windows and turned the prairie brown. The labor was long and difficult, and there were hours when Clara was certain she would die just like her mother had during a stillbirth when Clara was 10. But Lucas stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead and telling her she was strong. She could do this, just a little more. When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and screaming, Clara burst into tears of relief and exhaustion and overwhelming love. The doctor placed the baby in her arms, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt her heart expand to hold this new person who was half her, half Lucas, entirely their miracle. "What should we name him?" Lucas asked, his voice thick with emotion. Clara thought about her father who had worked this land until the flood took him, about her mother who had sung while she cooked, about the life she had lost and the life she had built from its ashes. "Thomas, after my father, Thomas Quinn." Lucas kissed her forehead gently. "Thomas Quinn." "It is perfect." Parenthood was exhausting and exhilarating, and nothing like Clara had imagined. Thomas was a fussy baby who slept poorly and cried often. And there were nights when Clara sat in the rocking chair weeping from exhaustion, while Lucas paced the floor with their son, trying everything to soothe him. But there were also mornings when she woke to find Lucas and Thomas asleep together in the big chair. The baby curled on his father's chest, and the sight made every sleepless night worthwhile. As Thomas grew, the house filled with the sounds of childhood, laughter and tears and the patter of small feet. Lucas taught his son to ride before he could barely walk, setting him on a gentle mare and leading them around the yard while Clara watched with her heart in her throat. Clara taught Thomas his letters and numbers, determined he would have the education she had always wanted. 2 years after Thomas came a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Lucas's mother. Then 3 years after that, another son, Michael. The house expanded with the family, new rooms added as needed, until the simple 2-room structure Lucas had built in 1889 was a sprawling 5-bedroom home with a proper kitchen, a dining room, and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The cattle operation grew too. Lucas proved to have a gift for ranching, and within 5 years, he had increased his herd to nearly 100 head, more than the 40 acres could support. Clara renegotiated their agreement, leasing him an additional 20 acres in exchange for a larger percentage of profits. They became true partners, discussing business decisions together, planning for the future together, building an enterprise that supported their growing family comfortably. In 1895, 6 years after the flood, the Wichita newspaper ran a story about local families who had rebuilt after the disaster. A reporter came to interview Clara and Lucas, and Clara found herself telling the story of those dark days, of the house she had lost, and the man who had helped her build a new one. "You ever regret staying in Kansas?" the reporter asked. "Your husband could have taken that job in Oklahoma and made more money." Clara looked at Lucas, who was teaching 5-year-old Thomas how to rope a fence post in the yard, and smiled. "Money is not everything. This land, this home, this family, these are the things that matter. The flood taught me that. You can lose everything material in a single night, but what you build in your heart, that is yours forever." The reporter scribbled notes, then looked up. "What would you say to other people who have lost everything, who do not know how to start over?" Clara thought about the woman she had been, standing in the mud staring at nothing, hollow and broken. She thought about the long journey back to joy, the small steps that had seemed impossible at the time but had led here, to this full and beautiful life. "I would say that grief is real and devastating and you have to honor it. But I would also say that you are stronger than you think. That sometimes help comes from unexpected places, and it is okay to accept it. That rebuilding is possible, even when it seems impossible. And most importantly, I would say that where you build is as important as what you build. Choose higher ground, literally and figuratively. Learn from the disaster. Build smarter and stronger. Do not just recreate what was lost. Create something new and better." The article ran the following week, and Clara received letters from all over Kansas, people sharing their own stories of loss and recovery, thanking her for putting into words what they had felt. She answered every letter personally, and she and Lucas became known in the community as people who understood hardship and could offer not just sympathy, but practical advice. The years rolled by, measured in harvests and cattle sales, in children growing and new additions to the house. Clara's garden became legendary in Wichita, her vegetables and flowers so abundant that she sold the surplus at the market every Saturday. Lucas's cattle consistently brought top dollar at auction, his reputation for quality stock spreading throughout the region. They were not rich by the standards of the Kansas City elite, but by the standards of farmers and ranchers, they were remarkably successful. In 1899, 10 years after their marriage, Lucas came home one evening with a surveyor's map and a proposition. "The land adjacent to ours just went up for sale. Another 80 acres, good grazing land. I want to buy it." He spread the map on the kitchen table, showing Clara the boundaries. "We have enough saved and it would give us room to double the herd." Clara studied the map, her mind working through the numbers. They could afford it, barely. It would mean tight years ahead, every penny going back into the operation. But it would also mean security, real wealth, the ability to give their children opportunities neither she nor Lucas had enjoyed. Let us do it. They bought the land, and Lucas hired 2 ranch hands to help manage the expanded operation. The gamble paid off. Within 5 years, they owned 250 acres and ran nearly 300 head of cattle. They built a proper barn and bunkhouse for the workers. They bought a buggy so Clara did not have to ride everywhere on horseback. They put money aside for the children's education, determined that Thomas and Elizabeth and Michael would have choices about their futures. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful young man who loved the land as much as his parents did. Elizabeth was bright and restless, constantly asking questions and reading everything she could get her hands on. Michael was the daredevil, always climbing something or chasing something or trying some stunt that made Clara's heart stop. They were all so different, but Lucas loved each of them fiercely, tailoring his parenting to their individual needs. Clara sometimes thought about the children she might have had if she had married one of the farm boys who had courted her before the flood. They would have been different people, born into different circumstances. She would have been a different person, never tested by tragedy, never forced to discover her own strength. She could not quite regret the flood, terrible as it had been, because without it, she would never have met Lucas, would never have built this life. One evening in the summer of 1905, Clara and Lucas sat on their porch watching the sunset, a ritual they still observed whenever possible, despite the demands of 3 active children and a thriving ranch. Thomas was 17 now, courting a girl from town. Elizabeth was 15 and talking about becoming a teacher. Michael was 12 and currently obsessed with trains. "You remember the day we met?" Clara asked, taking Lucas's hand, "when you found me standing at the old farm site. I remember thinking you looked like you had given up on everything, and I remember hoping I could help you find a reason not to. You did more than that. You gave me back my life." She leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable and content. "I was thinking today about how much has changed. When I met you, I owned 80 acres and nothing else. Now we have 250 acres, 3 children, a house that keeps growing, more cattle than I can count. We built an empire from nothing." Lucas kissed the top of her head. "We built a family. The land and the cattle, those are just details. What matters is right here." He gestured to the house behind them where they could hear the children arguing good-naturedly about something. "This, us, the life we made together. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had taken that job in Oklahoma?" "No, because I know exactly what would have happened. I would have been successful and wealthy and completely miserable because you would not have been there." He turned to face her, his green eyes still as striking as the day they met, though now there were lines around them from years of sun and laughter. "Marrying you was the best decision I ever made, Clara. Every good thing in my life came from that choice." She kissed him, long and sweet, still feeling that flutter in her chest after 16 years of marriage. "I love you, Lucas Quinn. I love you too. Always have, always will." In 1910, Thomas married his sweetheart and brought her to live on the ranch. Lucas helped them build a small house on the northern edge of the property, and Clara watched her son start his own family with a mixture of pride and bittersweet nostalgia. Where had the time gone? It seemed like just yesterday she was holding a red-faced newborn, and now Thomas was a man, a husband, preparing to become a father himself. Elizabeth left for teachers' college in Topeka, and the house felt empty without her quick wit and endless questions. She wrote letters every week, full of enthusiasm for her studies and descriptions of city life that made Clara smile. Michael talked about leaving too, about seeing the world beyond Kansas, and though it hurt to think of him going, Clara understood. She had raised her children to be brave and independent. She could not fault them for becoming exactly what she had hoped. In the spring of 1911, Thomas and his wife presented Clara and Lucas with their first grandchild, a girl they named Clara after her grandmother. Holding that tiny baby, seeing her son's face transform with the same love and terror she remembered from her own early days of parenthood, Clara felt the circle of life complete itself in a way that was both painful and beautiful. "You are a grandmother," Lucas teased that evening, watching Clara rock baby Clara to sleep. "How does it feel?" "Terrifying. I remember how hard it was with Thomas, and now I have to watch my son go through all of that." But she was smiling, unable to take her eyes off the sleeping baby. "But also wonderful. She is perfect, just like her grandmother." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Michael did leave eventually, taking a job with the railroad and sending letters from towns across the country. Elizabeth graduated and took a teaching position in Wichita, close enough to visit regularly. Thomas and his wife had 3 more children, and the ranch that had once been Clara's solitary refuge became the center of a sprawling, noisy, loving extended family. In 1920, 31 years after the flood, Clara was 53 years old and Lucas was 57. They had sold off most of the cattle operation, keeping just enough livestock to stay busy but not overwhelmed. Thomas ran the ranch now, with Clara and Lucas serving as advisors and doting grandparents. The house that Lucas had built in 1889 had been renovated and expanded so many times it barely resembled the original structure, but the bones were still solid, the foundation still sound. One afternoon in early June, Clara walked down to the site of her parents' old farm. She had not been there in years, avoiding the place because the memories were still sharp. But today, for some reason, she felt called to visit. The landscape had changed dramatically since 1889. The river had been redirected after another flood in 1903, moved further from the farms to prevent future disasters. Trees had grown up where her parents' house had stood, nature reclaiming what the water had taken. Clara stood in the shade of those trees and thought about the girl she had been, broken and lost, certain her life was over at 22. If she could speak to that girl now, what would she say? That the pain does fade. That happiness is possible again. That sometimes losing everything is the beginning, not the end. She heard hoofbeats and turned to see Lucas riding toward her, his hair gray now but his seat in the saddle still sure. He had known, somehow, where she was. After 31 years of marriage, they could read each other like favorite books, knowing every page by heart. "You all right?" he asked, swinging down beside her. "Yes, just remembering." She slipped her hand into his, their fingers intertwining automatically. "Thinking about how far we have come." Lucas looked around the overgrown site, then up at the hill where their house stood solid against the sky. "From there to here, quite a journey. The best journey of my life." They stood there together in the dappled shade, 2 people who had found each other in the aftermath of disaster and built something remarkable. The flood had taken her home and nearly her will to live. The cowboy had built her a new one on higher ground. But more than that, they had built a life together, full of love and children and grandchildren and the kind of deep contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be. As they walked back to their horses, Clara took one last look at the site. She had made peace with it finally, with the loss and the grief and the long struggle back to wholeness. The flood was part of her story, but it was not the whole story. The whole story was written in the house on the hill, in the children who carried her and Lucas forward into the future, in the love that had sustained them through 3 decades of joys and sorrows. "Ready to go home?" Lucas asked. Clara smiled up at him, this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, who she had also saved in return. "Yes, let us go home." They rode up the hill together as the sun climbed toward its zenith, heading back to the house built on higher ground, back to the life they had made from nothing, back to the love that had survived every storm. And Clara knew, with the certainty that comes from having lived through the worst and found the best on the other side, that she was truly and completely home at last.